This is the story of a man whose chance discovery on a frosty morning in January 1848 would transform his life, revolutionize the gold country, and alter the course of world history. It is also the story of a man who had the most to gain from the California gold rush, but died embittered and penniless. Our story begins here, on the banks of the American River in El Dorado County, in the little village of Coloma. This is James Marshall. Marshall, a transplant from New Jersey by way of Missouri, arrived at Sutter's Fort in July 1845 and was quickly hired by John Sutter, imperious master of his inland empire called New Helvetia. Marshall soon became a Sutter favorite for carpentry and building construction. Marshall was clever and a jack of all trades, but he could be diffident and sullen. Quite simply, he was a difficult fellow to like. Sutter described Marshall as, quote, a very curious man who quarreled with nearly everybody, though I got along with him very well. He dressed in buckskin and wore a serape. I thought him half crazy. Sutter asked Marshall to find an appropriate site for a sawmill in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Sutter's kingdom needed lumber, and a less expensive, more readily available supply was necessary. After considering several locations, James Marshall chose the Coloma Valley, which straddled the American River about 30 miles east of Sacramento. The valley nestled on the cusp of the Sierra Nevada, and abundant forest reserves were nearby. It seemed perfect, and John Sutter was pleased. Sutter and Marshall entered into a partnership. Sutter would provide the capital, and Marshall would construct and manage the sawmill. An agreement was reached with the local Mayadu natives, and Marshall began construction of the sawmill in 1847. Laborers and artisans, mostly Mormons, were hired and they eagerly began work. Usually an efficient builder, Marshall's efforts were hit and miss, as he had never before constructed anything as intricate as a sawmill. By the end of that year, the mill was finished, but a problem arose. The tail race, the drainage ditch leading away from the water-powered mill, was too shallow. Water could not efficiently flow through, leaving the mill wheel incapable of functioning correctly. In order to make the giant wooden paddle wheel turn properly, the tail race had to be deepened. James Marshall's workforce pried boulders free and shoveled away dirt. At night, the river was rerouted through the ditch to loosen the soil and wash away debris. On a chilly morning in mid-January 1848, while inspecting the previous night's progress, Marshall found a pea-sized gold flake glimmering in the tail race. Then he saw another and another as yellow shafts of light pierced the construction site. Marshall would later write of that moment, quote, I discovered the gold. I was entirely alone at the time. I picked up one or two pieces and examined them attentively, and having some general knowledge of minerals, I could not call to mind more than two which in any way resembled this. Sulphuret of iron, very bright and brittle, and gold, bright yet malleable. Unquote. James Marshall was stunned. He continued, quote, it made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold. Unquote. Marshall repaired to a tree stump and began to, as he put it, think right hard about what to do next. Years later, Marshall remembered the date as January 19, 1848, but the more detailed diary of employee Henry Bigler set the date as January 24th, which became the historically accepted day of discovery. This is James Marshall's own drawing of the discovery of the gold. Marshall hurried to inform John Sutter in Sacramento, and they tested the find at Sutter's Fort. It was gold, very pure gold. Concerned that a gold strike would result in an exodus of workers, an incomplete sawmill, and a wasted investment, Sutter and Marshall decided to keep the find a secret. It would not remain a secret for long, and the California gold rush began. Individuals such as Sam Brannan would announce the gold discovery in San Francisco, and the rush was on. Following the gold discovery, Marshall claimed ownership of the Coloma Valley, but his declaration was drowned by a rising tide of passionate gold seekers who did not give a damn about social conventions or legal proprieties. Marshall turned to prospecting. He was continually followed by the lazy, the unscrupulous, or the neophytes, who were counting on Marshall's supposed Midas touch. In 1908, a writer known as the Pioneer remembered the process of what he called trailing Marshall. The Pioneer wrote, quote, "Like most gold seekers, I, for one, was not satisfied, and had the belief that if Marshall, the discoverer of gold, could be shadowed, the fountainhead would be found. Knowledge having been gained of Marshall's starting with the party up between the north and middle forks of the American River, our party of about 7 in number followed his, always keeping a sufficient distance in the rear to escape discovery by his party. It is forgotten how many days his party was trailed, but suddenly one day we came upon him having a siesta about noon. I well remember his appearance and about what he said. He smiled and said that he knew nothing of where gold existed any more than we did. After a short halt, our party moved on to hunt further for the precious metal." Many of these so-called trailers were not as benign as the Pioneer, and threatened violent reprisals if James Marshall did not succeed in finding the golden bounty. Fearing for his life, Marshall left Coloma for 6 months. The mill was abandoned. The American River was diverted by placer mining, seeking gold in the riverbed, and Marshall's mill was left high and dry. In 1853, a government survey reported that the mill had been purchased, quote, "with the intention of making walking sticks from its timbers," unquote. Returning to Coloma, Marshall was deeply in debt, and he sold his property to satisfy creditors. He tried prospecting again. No luck. In 1857, Marshall bought 15 acres in Coloma and started a vineyard. It was successful, initially. Marshall even earned a medal for his wine at the El Dorado County Fair. Marshall built a cabin, but high taxes and competition led to setbacks. He tried mining once more. Purchasing a quartz gold mine near the little hamlet of Kelsey, about 5 miles from Coloma, Marshall and a partner struggled with hard rock mining. Mostly, they failed. In the 1860s, Marshall booked a lecture tour to spark interest and investment in the mine. A book chronicling his exploits was published, but Marshall's efforts were futile. James Marshall spent his last pennies on these failed enterprises. Destitute, angry, increasingly eccentric in his behavior, and drinking heavily, Marshall returned to Kelsey and started a blacksmith shop. In February 1872, the California State Legislature passed a law entitled, quote, "An Act to Appropriate Money for the Relief of James W. Marshall," unquote, providing a $200 monthly pension. $200 in 1872 would be the equivalent of about $4,000 today. Renewed several times, the pension was ended in 1878, following criticism of Marshall's alcoholism. According to legend, when Marshall appeared before the State Assembly to testify in his own behalf, a whiskey bottle fell from his pocket and crashed to the floor. James Marshall scraped along at his blacksmith shop in Kelsey. He made a few dollars by selling autograph cards, featuring his scrawling signature and listing the gold discovery date as January 19, 1848. But he never prospered. Friends despaired. Philip Baker, who knew Marshall as a boy, remarked in 1924, quote, "All historians have given Marshall credit for being the discoverer of gold in the Sierras, but have handled him roughly in other ways, probably because of his mannerisms and his drinking. He was so badly treated by the early settlers who robbed him, and by some of the arrivals of 1848 and 1849 who persecuted him, and he became a misanthrope. He was disgusted with the way fate had used him, and with the exception of a few old friends, wanted to be left alone," unquote. Others were not as forgiving. On January 24, 1898, the Placerville newspaper, the Mountain Democrat, issued a 50th anniversary edition commemorating the gold discovery in Coloma. Their characterization of Marshall's final years is scathing. Quote, "Marshall scattered his money indiscriminately among his friends and parasites, and soon he became little more than a common sot. Although naturally worthy of better things, he deteriorated until, in plain English, he was unprepossessing in appearance, untidy in person, and filthy in habits. His habitation was reeking of tobacco juice, strewn and plastered with antiquated quids, or plugs of chewing tobacco, and redolent of creosote." Unquote. James Marshall died in 1885 at the age of 75. He is buried on a Coloma hillside near his old vineyard and cabin. The James Marshall Gold Discovery Monument that marks the spot was the result of a $9,000 legislative appropriation to construct a memorial to Marshall. $9,000 in 1885 would be the equivalent of about $220,000 today. A bronze-coated zinc statue of James Marshall crowns an ornate pedestal. The figure of Marshall supposedly points to the gold discovery site, but he actually gestures to the right of where the gold was originally found. It is fitting. Gold seekers expected James Marshall to magically indicate gold when he was alive, and he could not. It seems appropriate that even his bronze replacement guides us to the wrong spot. The James Marshall Gold Discovery Monument is reached by one of California's least known oddities, California Highway 153. At only 1/2 mile in length, it is officially designated as California's shortest state highway.